He was handcuffed on his own front lawn, still wearing his hospital badge. Neighbors filmed, officers shouted, and somewhere in the chaos, his white neighbor whispered, "They think he broke into his own house." 1 minute, he was a respected black doctor. The next, a suspect. And when they found out who he really was, it was already too late. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The polished marble floors of Montgomery Preparatory stretched before Elijah Grant like a challenge. The heavy oak doors had barely swung shut behind him when the first glance came. Sharp, dismissive, and calculated. A tall, sandy-haired boy with monogrammed cufflinks paused his conversation just long enough to let Elijah know, "You don't belong here." Montgomery Prep was the kind of place where ceilings arched high, chandeliers sparkled in daylight, and voices rarely rose above a cultured murmur. Generations of wealth and expectation lingered in the air like cologne. Every student walked like they were born into it, because most of them were. But Elijah? He'd stepped off the city bus 30 minutes earlier. His uniform, pressed with the same iron his mother used to do hospital bedsheets, fit a little loose in the shoulders. His shoes, second-hand Oxfords found in a church donation box, shined with extra effort, but pinched at the heels. He carried only a backpack, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and a letter that said full academic scholarship. To most, that meant charity. To Elijah, it was proof. But proof didn't mean welcome. He stepped into the main hall, and everything got quiet. It wasn't silence exactly. Conversations still hummed. Laughter rang in pockets. But the space around him shifted, like air bending around an invisible force. Students turned without turning. Whispers didn't lower. They paused, and he felt it, the way black boys have always felt it. The weight of being watched, judged, measured against standards he was never told. He kept walking, past portraits of senators, CEOs and Rhodes Scholars, all white, all male, past bulletin boards decorated with announcements for fencing tryouts, yacht club meetings, and a Harvard legacy luncheon. The school's Latin motto stretched across the archway above the commons, ex scientia dignitas, from knowledge, dignity. But dignity was not what the hallway gave him. "Elijah Grant," he whispered under his breath, like grounding himself. 12. Top 1% in the state. Differential calculus by 10. The words didn't echo. They weren't meant to. He was reminding himself that he earned this, even if no one else believed it. Down the corridor, a pair of girls watched him pass. One leaned toward the other, whispering with a smirk, "I didn't know we had a new janitor." The other laughed, soft and rehearsed, as if it were only a joke. Elijah's jaw tensed, not because of the words he'd heard, but because of how casual they were. The way cruelty could be elegant when wrapped in wealth. When he reached his locker, 1193, a prime number, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Something about primes felt personal to him. Indivisible, rare, standing alone. He opened a locker and unpacked methodically. Graph paper, 4 pencils, a worn calculator he'd cleaned with a toothbrush the night before. Everything labeled, everything accounted for. There wasn't room for mistakes when you came from nothing. Not in school, not in life. The first bell rang, sharp, demanding. He checked his schedule. Advanced mathematics, room. The corridors seemed to stretch forever. The farther he walked, the more polished everything felt. Floors, accents, reputations. By the time he reached the door, his hands were cold. Not from fear, from focus. He paused before entering. Through the glass, he saw them. Students already seated, laughing, tossing equations back and forth, like jokes. One of them, a boy with perfect posture and an air of inheritance, pointed at the board and laughed. "My dad says this problem was on his MIT entrance exam." A girl with a Cartier bracelet replied, "Mine says Professor Ashford gives it to weed out the weak." Weed out the weak. Elijah exhaled slowly, then opened the door. 22 heads turned. The laughter faded instantly. It wasn't that they stared. It was how. Like he'd walked into the wrong room. Like he'd wandered into a gated community without a passcode. Only one seat was left. Middle row. Dead center. He walked toward it slowly, each step measured, feeling the weight of every eye. A boy near the front stage whispered, "They really are letting anyone in now." His friend chuckled behind a textbook. Elijah sat, unfolded his notebook. Didn't look up. He could hear a girl behind him murmuring something about admissions reform. Another talking about public school projects. Every phrase was a calculation, and every word told him the same thing. This room wasn't designed for him, but he wasn't here to fit the design. When the classroom door opened again, it wasn't a student. It was Professor Ronald Ashford. Silver-haired, posture perfect, tie too tight. His reputation arrived 5 seconds before he did. 40 years of teaching, 3 published textbooks. Known for 2 things: excellence in eliminating what he called academic inflation. He stepped to the board without a word and began writing. A differential equation unfolded line by line, symbols clean and deliberate. The room stilled as the problem grew more complex. The students straightened, pencils lifted, and then Elijah saw it. The equation, elegant, intricate, towering, had a flaw. It was small. A sign error. One misaligned coefficient in a nested term. Invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to see it. But Elijah saw it the moment the chalk hit the board. The bell rang, crisp and cold.
No one else reacted.
They all stared, scribbled notes, prepped their answers, unaware that the problem itself was broken. Designed to fail. Elijah blinked slowly. Not from doubt, from something deeper. Because for the first time, he realized this wasn't just a test of intelligence. It was something else. A trap. One so subtle it could only have come from someone who expected him to miss it. And that's when it hit him. Professor Ashford didn't make a mistake. He made a decision. And Elijah, alone in that sea of confidence and calculation, now had a decision of his own. Call it out, and risk humiliation, or solve it anyway, and play by someone else's rules. The bell had rung, but Elijah's mind was already elsewhere. That single deliberate flaw on Professor Ashford's board haunted him, the negative sign that shouldn't have been there. He'd seen it instantly, the way a musician hears a wrong note, but he hadn't said a word. Not yet. Speaking too soon in this room could end everything before it began. After class, he walked out quietly, blending into the hum of students trading weekend plans and lacrosse schedules. His silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. He'd learned that brilliance, in certain places, needed to be quiet before it could be heard. Outside, the late September air felt different. Sharp, unwelcoming. The bronze plaques along the walkway gleamed in the sunlight, each engraved with the name of a donor or legacy family. None of them read Grant. He passed the parking lot lined with Teslas and Range Rovers, found his way to the bus stop, and sat with his backpack clutched to his chest. The other kids left in cars driven by men in suits. Elijah waited for the 4:15 city bus. Inside that bag was everything that made him dangerous to the assumptions around him. His second-hand notebooks. At home, the one-bedroom apartment smelled faintly of detergent and burnt toast. His mother, Lena Grant, was already gone for her night shift at the hospital. A note on the counter read in rushed handwriting. Dinner in the fridge. You're gonna do great, baby. I love you. The microwave hummed as he reheated the leftovers. But he didn't sit down to eat. The apartment was small enough that his desk doubled as their kitchen table. He cleared it, pulled out a candle stub, and set his notebooks before him. There were 5 of them, mismatched and taped together along the spines. The covers were worn, the pages creased and smudged, but every inch of paper was filled. Equations, cross-referenced notes, annotations from library printouts, even rough proofs of problems no one had assigned. He'd written them like a diary of discovery. Every formula, every line, every correction, proof that he was self-taught in a world that assumed self-taught meant unprepared. The North Side Public Library had raised him more faithfully than any teacher ever had. Mrs. Rowe, the head librarian, used to joke that she should start charging him rent. When the library's lights dimmed at closing time, she would pretend not to see him still working in the corner, his head bent over stacks of borrowed books. Elijah, she'd say, jingling her keys. Don't make me drag you out again. Just 5 more minutes, Mrs. Rowe, he'd plead without looking up. You said that 20 minutes ago. I'm close this time. I think I've figured out the symmetry in this sequence. She'd sigh, but she never forced him to leave. All right, she'd whisper, flicking off one light instead of all. But you lock up when you're done, genius. She meant it as a tease. But the word genius stayed with him. Not because he believed it, but because it was the first time anyone had said it without disbelief. The library was where Elijah learned to see beauty in structure, Fibonacci spirals in ivy vines, golden ratios in staircases, logic in chaos. When his mother's paycheck couldn't cover the electric bill, He'd study by candlelight at home. The flame flickered across his papers, casting long shadows that moved like restless thoughts. Mathematics became his way of fighting darkness, literally and metaphorically. While the rest of the neighborhood went quiet in the blackout, he worked. Equations didn't care if you lived in a penthouse or a public housing unit. They obeyed the same rules for everyone. In numbers, there was justice. He never forgot the first time he solved something that wasn't supposed to be solvable, at least not by someone his age. He'd found a stack of discarded journals in the library's recycling bin. One of them contained an article about a problem that had stumped mathematicians for years. A partial case of the Birch and Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture. The equations sprawled across 4 pages. Elijah couldn't understand half the notation at first, but he recognized the rhythm of it, the dance between symmetry and imbalance. He worked on it for weeks, writing and rewriting, calculating by hand until the margins disappeared beneath his pencil marks. Somewhere around the 3rd candle, he saw it, the missing step, the correction no one had mentioned. A subtle substitution that made the whole thing work. He sat back in shock, heart pounding. He didn't know if he had solved it fully. He only knew that something impossible had just bent to his will. He wanted to tell someone, but there was no one to tell. His mother wouldn't understand the equations, only the exhaustion in his eyes. His teachers at his old public school thought he was making mistakes when he was actually inventing shortcuts. In online forums, he'd tried that once. He'd posted a solution under a thread titled "Possible Simplification of a BSD Subset." The replies came fast, and none were kind. "Kid, this isn't algebra homework. You don't even understand the problem. Go play video games, junior mathematician." He deleted the post within the hour. But the words stayed. That was the night he decided not to chase recognition. He'd chase understanding instead. At Montgomery Prep, that decision was tested every single day. His classmates carried brand new MacBooks, private tutor notes, and parents who had their professors' phone numbers. Elijah carried a thrift store calculator with a faded display and the quiet conviction that numbers loved him back. During lunch, he'd sit under the oak tree behind the science building, balancing his tray on his knees while he worked through old Olympiad problems. Sometimes he'd overhear conversations from the tables nearby. "Dad says the scholarship kids are costing the school too much." "Yeah. And for what? They drop out after a semester anyway. Still, imagine getting in just because you're different." Different. That word had a way of staining everything. He'd grip his pencil tighter, pressing equations harder into the page until the indentations tore the paper. But he never looked up, never gave them the satisfaction of reaction, because he knew something they didn't. His silence wasn't submission. It was focus sharpening into something unbreakable. On Thursdays, he'd stop by the library again, after school. Mrs. Rowe still greeted him with the same line. "Didn't they build you a computer lab at that fancy place yet?" "They did," Elijah would answer, unpacking his notebooks at the same corner table. "But theirs close at 4. Yours never really closes, does it?" Mrs. Rowe would chuckle. "Not for you, it doesn't." It was during one of those evenings that Elijah made a discovery he couldn't explain, not even to himself. He was working through a number theory problem involving modular forms when something clicked. Not just a solution, but a pattern underlying multiple problems he'd encountered before. A kind of mathematical fingerprint repeating itself across different branches of study. It was subtle, but powerful, like uncovering a shared heartbeat between separate systems. He labeled it the cascade pattern. It was nothing official, just a name in his notebook margin. But as he explored it further, he realized it simplified problems that had previously taken pages to solve. It wasn't just a shortcut. It was a revelation. He wanted to test it, to share it, but he knew better than to bring it to school yet. Not when every answer he gave was already double-checked for credibility simply because of who he was. So he wrote it down carefully, one page at a time, building his proof by candlelight, until the last flame sputtered out. That Friday, a storm rolled through the city, shaking windows and rattling pipes in the old apartment building. His mother worked another double shift, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts in a pile of unsolved problems. He worked through the noise, thunder, rain, the occasional siren outside, until his pencil dulled to a stub. On his desk next to a half-eaten sandwich, his mother's old phone buzzed. A reminder she'd set before leaving. "Good luck on your first test Monday. You got this." He smiled faintly, though the word test tightened something in his chest. It wasn't just another quiz. It was Professor Ashford's first major assessment, the one that decided who stayed in the advanced class and who got redirected. He'd overheard a senior say once that Ashford liked to weed out the charity cases early. Elijah wasn't planning on being weeded out. He reviewed his notes one last time. Derivatives, integrals, proofs, then opened his own creation, the cascade pattern. His pencil traced it slowly, step by step, refining it until he reached a point no textbook had ever guided him to. The numbers aligned, the logic flowed. It was beautiful and new. He sat back stunned. What he'd just written wasn't a solution from anyone else's work. It was his. A method so elegant that if proven correct, it could change how certain equations were taught entirely. He didn't fully understand the magnitude of it yet, but something deep in him knew this was more than a clever trick. It was discovery. He stared at the page, heart pounding, then underlined it twice. Cascade method. Then the lights flickered and went out completely. The room went dark. The storm outside howled like an omen. But Elijah didn't move. He knew where everything was. The candle, the matchbox, the pen. He relit the flame and leaned forward, smiling faintly as its glow hit the fresh ink. It wasn't the first time he'd worked in the dark. But tonight, the darkness felt different, alive. And on the night before his first big test, Elijah Grant unknowingly cracked a problem even experts had dismissed for years. A discovery that by Monday morning would shake Montgomery Preparatory to its very core. Monday morning came heavy with rain, the kind that soaked through coats and blurred the world into shades of gray. For most students at Montgomery Preparatory, it was just another day of privilege in motion. Chauffeurs holding umbrellas, designer bags carried dry from car to classroom. But for Elijah Grant, standing at the bus stop with his notebook wrapped in plastic, it was something else entirely. The storm didn't bother him. It matched the rhythm of his thoughts, quick, sharp, relentless. Inside his backpack sat the pages he'd filled the night before, where lightning had cracked outside and an idea had cracked open inside him. The cascade method. His method, the discovery he didn't yet understand but couldn't stop thinking about. As the bus hissed to a stop, Elijah stepped aboard and found his usual seat in the back, near a fogged window. He pulled the notebook out again, reading over the lines by the dim light flickering overhead. His handwriting was small, deliberate, each symbol precise, each note margin squeezed. What if it was real? What if he had actually found something new, something that mattered? He almost laughed at himself. A kid from Northside, he whispered under his breath. Finding something the professors missed? The thought sounded impossible. But then again, so did getting into Montgomery Prep. He ran his thumb across the edge of the page where he'd written it. Cascade. He didn't know why he called it that, only that it fit, because once the pattern started, everything else followed, like falling dominoes. When the bus reached the school, the rain had softened to mist. The other students hurried inside, muttering about ruined shoes and wet hair. Elijah lingered for a moment at the steps, staring up at the stone facade. The building looked older, heavier somehow, as if it knew what awaited him. He was early, deliberately. He liked the silence before the corridors filled, the moments when the walls didn't whisper. He found room 304 unlocked, the faint smell of chalk dust in the air. The board from last week was clean now, wiped to white. He stood there for a moment, imagining the professor's hand scrawling across it again, crafting problems like traps. He took a seat in the middle, the same one as before, and opened his notebook. His fingers brushed the plastic cover he'd wrapped around it to keep out the rain. He reread his notes until the door opened, and voices filled the space. Timothy Vance, blonde, athletic, confident, entered first. "Morning," he said, though not to Elijah. He tossed his soaked blazer onto his chair and turned to his friend, a tall boy with slicked back hair. "Heard Ashford's giving us a diagnostic test today. Bet he's going to fail half the class." His friend laughed. "Except us, right?" Timothy smirked. "Obviously. He told my dad I was a natural." Elijah kept his eyes on his notebook. He'd learned not to look up when they talked. It only invited the next line. Sure enough, it came. "Hey Grant," Timothy said, voice loud enough to draw attention. "You ready for your big day? Word is Ashford doesn't go easy on the scholarship students." Laughter rippled around the room. Elijah didn't respond. He flipped to a new page and drew a line through the center, setting up his notes for whatever problem came next. His silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. People who wanted to humiliate you hated nothing more than your indifference. When Professor Ronald Ashford entered, the noise collapsed like air from a balloon. He carried himself like an institution, straight-backed, sharp-eyed, every movement precise. The chalk in his hand looked like a conductor's baton. "Good morning," he said, not smiling. His voice was calm but carried a weight that demanded obedience. "Today we will see where this class stands. I trust you've all reviewed the material." He turned to the board. Chalk squeaked. A few students straightened in their seats. Elijah watched as symbols began to take shape. Variables, coefficients, operators. It looked familiar at first. A second-order differential equation, linear, complex but solvable. Then, as the pattern grew, Elijah saw it. The error. A single negative sign that didn't belong. Small. Intentional. It flipped the entire equation's symmetry. Anyone solving it as written would chase an endless loop. It wasn't a typo. It was a setup. Ashford stepped back, admiring his work as though it were art. "This," he said, "is a standard equation you should all recognize. A suitable warm-up. Let's see who among you can solve it correctly." He didn't glance at Elijah yet, but the room already knew where this was going. Timothy leaned over to his friend and whispered, "He's gonna call on him. Watch." Elijah's pencil hovered over the page. He had two choices: correct it silently, or wait for the trap to spring. His stomach tightened, but his mind, that steady analytical machine, kept working. He could already see the path, the contradiction that would appear if they followed it through. Ashford turned. "Mr. Vance," he said, "would you care to begin?" Timothy grinned and rose to his feet. He approached the board like a performer, chalk in hand. The class watched as he began working through the steps confidently. For a while it looked impressive. Lines of equations cascading neatly, variables transforming as if rehearsed. Then came the flaw. The equation broke. His expression faltered. He hesitated, erased, rewrote. But the numbers no longer aligned. His rhythm shattered. He turned to Ashford, confused. "I think I must..." Ashford raised a hand. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. You may sit." The professor's tone wasn't cruel. Exactly. It was worse. Detached. As if Timothy's failure confirmed something he'd already decided. Ashford faced the class again, eyes scanning the rows like a general inspecting troops. "Perhaps someone else can illuminate where young Mr. Vance went wrong." No one moved. The silence stretched. Then, as if magnetized, his gaze landed on Elijah. "Mr. Grant." The air thickened. "Yes, sir?" Elijah's voice was calm but low. "You've been quiet," Ashford said. "Surely your self-study has equipped you to handle something of this level. Would you demonstrate?" Laughter flickered like static across the room. A few students exchanged looks, waiting for the entertainment to begin. Elijah rose slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He walked to the front, feeling every pair of eyes track his steps. The board loomed before him, its flawed equation stretching across the surface, like a challenge. He didn't pick up the chalk immediately. He studied the lines, the negative sign, the deliberate imbalance. Ashford folded his arms. "Well, Mr. Grant?" Elijah finally turned to him. "There's a problem with the equation, sir." Ashford arched a brow. "A problem?" "Yes, sir. A sign inconsistency in the third line. The negative term shouldn't be there. It reverses the coefficient symmetry." The room stirred. Timothy snickered quietly. "He's saying the professor's wrong," someone whispered. Ashford's expression barely changed, but his eyes hardened. "Are you suggesting," he said slowly, "that I, after 40 years of teaching, have written a faulty equation?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if it was a question or a warning. "I'm suggesting," he said finally, "that if the negative sign stays, the system diverges instead of converging. It becomes unsolvable." For a heartbeat, the room was utterly silent. Ashford's jaw flexed. Then with icy calm he stepped aside. "By all means, Mr. Grant. Show us." Elijah hesitated, then took the chalk. It felt heavier than he expected, like it carried more than dust and calcium, like it carried centuries. He started slow, rewriting the equation line by line, explaining as he went. The sound of chalk scraping against the board filled the room, sharp and rhythmic. "If we reverse the sign," Elijah said, "we restore symmetry. The resulting term then simplifies to this." He drew another line. Faster now, his focus absolute. The students leaned forward. What had begun as a spectacle was turning into something else. Ashford's eyes followed each movement, the frown between his brows deepening. The boy wasn't reciting, he was thinking, building, reasoning in real time. After 5 minutes, Elijah stepped back. The equation was complete, balanced, beautiful. He turned, chalk dust on his fingertips. That's the corrected solution, sir. Ashford said nothing. The class was frozen. Then Timothy muttered, "He must have memorized it." Ashford latched onto it. "Indeed," he said coolly. "Perhaps you've seen this problem before." "No, sir," Elijah replied. But the structure made the sign error obvious. Ashford's lips curved, not quite a smile. "So you believe you can see errors others miss? How extraordinary." He paused, then added softly, "Tell me, Mr. Grant, do you also believe intelligence is independent of discipline?" Elijah frowned. "I don't understand." Ashford stepped closer. "Because that's what you're implying. That brilliance can appear anywhere, without guidance, without refinement, that you can rival trained minds with candlelight and Wi-Fi." The words hit harder than a shout. There was no anger in them, only disbelief disguised as civility. The class waited. Elijah met his gaze. "I don't believe in rivals, sir. I believe in solutions." A quiet gasp rippled through the students. Even Ashford blinked, surprised. The boy's tone was steady, respectful, but unshakable. "Solutions," Ashford repeated. "Very well. Solve this then." He erased half the board, leaving the corrected section intact, and began writing something new faster this time, more complex. Layers of functions folded into each other. Symbols no longer neat, but tangled. When he was done, he turned. "This," he said, "should separate memorization from understanding." He stepped back. The room held its breath. Elijah studied the problem. It was advanced well beyond high school, but the patterns glimmered beneath the chaos. He recognized echoes of his own cascade idea, though Ashford couldn't have known that. His pulse quickened. Minutes passed. The clock ticked. Then Elijah's pencil began to move again. Slowly, methodically. He didn't erase once. When he finally stopped, the solution wasn't just correct. It was simplified, elegant. It cut through the noise like light through fog. He set the chalk down gently. Ashford stared at the board, at the boy, at the impossible neatness of it all. For the first time, his composure cracked. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Elijah hesitated. "Public library." A few students laughed, uncertain, awkward. But the words hung heavy in the air. Ashford opened his mouth to reply, but something in Elijah's eyes made him pause. A quiet defiance, a refusal to shrink. And in that pause, something shifted. Not just in the professor, but in the entire room. For the first time, they weren't laughing at him. They were listening. The bell rang, sharp and final. Ashford dismissed the class with a curt nod. His voice tight. "We'll continue this discussion tomorrow." Students filed out, whispering. Some glanced back at Elijah with new curiosity, others with silent resentment. Timothy pushed past him roughly, muttering, "Enjoy it while it lasts." Elijah gathered his things, the smell of chalk still clinging to his hands. He looked once at the board, now covered in his handwriting, and then at the professor's desk. Ashford hadn't moved. He was staring at the equations, brow furrowed, as if trying to solve a different kind of problem, one that numbers couldn't explain. Elijah hesitated at the door, then turned back and raised his hand. Not to answer, but to ask a question that made the entire room fall silent. The question Elijah raised hung in the silence like a lightning rod. Every head in the classroom turned, every breath paused, waiting for what would come next. His voice had been composed, controlled, not an echo, not a challenge, but a quiet demand. Why wouldn't the professor write an incorrect equation? Professor Ashford stood at the front, chalk dust tracing patterns on his fingers. He looked at Elijah, then at the board, then at the class. For a moment it seemed as though time slowed. The students shifted in their seats. The tension in the room thickened, like static before a storm. Finally, Ashford cleared his throat. "An astute question, Mr. Grant," he said, voice measured. The confession twisted in his tone, more regret than pride. Sometimes, to separate the prepared from the complacent, a test must test more than technical ability. It must test presence, confidence under pressure. A ripple of murmur moved through the students. Some nodded, some frowned. Timothy's lips curled in a sneer. Elijah's heart thundered, but his face remained calm. Ashford turned back to the board. With a slow chalk stroke, he began erasing part of the corrected section. Elijah had written, The room watched as he carefully reconstructed segments, rehanging the original flawed form, but this time with new terms layered on top. The test he was preparing would be more than algebra. It would be judgment. Elijah, Ashford said, you have challenged more than an equation today. You have challenged an idea that mistakes are always mistakes, that brilliance can't emerge from those least expected. He paused, letting the weight of it sink in. The next test you take in this class will measure not just skill but integrity, not just speed, but discernment. Elijah watched, wary. Ashford's eyes flickered, as though calculating something behind the facade. The professor's respect was not yet earned. It would have to be proven. Other students muttered among themselves. Some admired, some resented. Sarah Kim, the girl seated 2 rows in front, whispered to her neighbor, "Did he just call him brilliant in public class?" The neighbor shook her head, her notebook snapping shut. The bell cut through the tension. It was the signal, time to move on, or wallow in silence. Ashford collected his materials. "We'll pick up tomorrow from here," he said. "Mr. Grant, I expect you to distribute your corrected version to the class before then. Everyone should see both forms." Elijah's throat tightened. That request meant exposure. It meant that everyone would see his handwriting, his method, that moment of vulnerability and shock. He nodded. As students packed up, Timothy rose slowly, his face pale. He approached Elijah's desk. "That was luck," he said quietly. Bitterness splice-laced. "You just got lucky catching that sign error." Elijah closed his notebook. He looked at Timothy calmly. "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." Timothy's jaw clenched. He left without further words. Later that afternoon, Elijah found Ashford's posted assignment for the next test. It wasn't a review, it was something entirely new, a functional equation, with nested integrals and boundary constraints. It looked chaotic, unsymmetrical, designed for failure, if applied mechanically. He took a deep breath, then went to his backpack and pulled out the 5 second-hand notebooks. He flipped through them, searching for anything related. There were scraps of insight, half-developed ideas, references to modular forms, hints at his cascade pattern, but nothing that directly solved this. He murmured to himself, "They want to know not just my answer, but my thinking." When he left school, the sky was overcast again. Rain threatened. He walked the long route home, passing the same parks and storefronts he always had. The city felt quieter now, as though it sensed what lay ahead. At home, Lena Grant was back. She peeked out from the kitchen door when he walked in. "You okay, baby?" she asked. Her voice held a tired softness. She handed him a sandwich and some fruit. He nodded. "I'm fine," but she saw the tension in his shoulders. She didn't probe. She never did. They both understood the silent cost of ambition. He retreated to his desk, candle lit, notebook open. The assignment sat staring at him like a gauntlet. He tried straightforward approaches, linear methods, substitutions. Each attempt faltered. The integrals folded. The constraints refused. Nothing clean. Nothing satisfying. Something in him clicked. Pattern recognition. That feeling he'd begun to trust. That beneath chaos there is order. He pulled up the cascade pattern from memory, started to see fragments of mapping. He sketched new notation. He erased. He tried again. Hours passed. Rain drummed against the window. A siren in the distance. The city hummed far under his isolation. Then a twist he hadn't expected. A draft email notification from Professor Ashford. The subject line, "Your corrected version, submit early." The email body, "I appreciate your insight today. Submit tonight if you're ready. I will review before tomorrow's class." He froze. No professor should review student work a day early. Not in this environment. Why the sudden deference? Why the invitation before he'd even seen Elijah's full method? Something whispered to him. This wasn't just respect. It was a lure. He glanced at his notebooks. Any misrepresentation, any hidden error Ashford found could be weaponized. The trap had shifted. He realized the assignment wasn't just to test them. It was to see how far Elijah would go to protect his method. The rain broke then, sheets of it flooding the windows. Elijah looked at his progress. He'd found a path, a partial simplification, using modular symmetries, linked to his cascade insight. The final step eluded him, but he was closer than ever. His phone buzzed. Lena's number. He answered. "Mom, I'm working. I'll eat in a bit." Don't stay up too late, she said. You've been pushing yourself. He closed his eyes. I know. He hung up and reopened his notebooks. Under the candle's flare, he adjusted his logic, probing the boundary constraints until a solution shape began to emerge. Elegant, but delicate. But as he leaned forward, he felt something shift behind him. The room temperature dropped. His candle flickered. A page slipped off the notebook, as though drawn by wind. When he turned toward the door, he saw not a figure but a message chalked faintly on the wall beyond his desk. Prove who you are. He swallowed hard. The walls were silent again. Elijah's heart pounded. The trap had grown louder, and when he turned back to his notes, he realized a crucial line in his cascade pattern had been altered. Someone had invaded his notebook in the dark. The next morning, the air inside room 3-4 felt heavier than usual. It wasn't just weather or tension. It was the sense that something was about to happen, that none of them would forget. The faint smell of chalk dust lingered in the air, mixed with anticipation. Students filed in one by one, murmuring about yesterday's spectacle, the boy who had corrected the professor. Elijah sat quietly at his desk, his notebook open, his expression unreadable. He had barely slept. The image of the changed equation in his notebook still haunted him. Someone had been in his things. Someone who knew enough about math to alter his proof without breaking its surface logic. He'd spent half the night checking each symbol, each line, rewriting everything from memory. He didn't know if Professor Ashford had done it or if one of his classmates had found a way to get to him. Either way, it was clear someone wanted to see him stumble today. At precisely 8 o'clock, Professor Ashford entered. His suit was immaculate, his stride measured, his eyes cool. The chatter stopped instantly. He placed his briefcase on the desk and turned to face the class. Yesterday, he began, we encountered what I believe was an instructive moment, a demonstration of intellectual vigilance. His tone was calm, almost generous. Mr. Grant, you displayed keen observation. Today, I want to explore that observation further. Elijah's pulse quickened. Ashford turned to the board, writing in sweeping lines. Let's revisit our previous equation, he said. Only this time, let's expand its conditions, make it less of a simple exercise and more of a challenge worthy of your talents. He added variables, adjusted boundaries, layered the problem until it sprawled across the entire board. By the time he finished, it resembled the kind of problem seen in graduate seminars, not a middle school class. Timothy Vance whispered to his friend. He's setting him up. Ashford heard. He didn't correct him. He turned back to Elijah. Mr. Grant, he said softly, would you care to continue where we left off? Elijah stood. Every eye followed him. The room seemed smaller, closer. He could feel his classmates' curiosity pressing against him like a tide. He walked to the board. This time he didn't hesitate. He studied the equation, really studied it. Within seconds he saw the structure beneath the chaos, the symmetry hiding behind the tangled variables. His cascade pattern whispered at the back of his mind. He picked up the chalk. First, he said quietly, I'll rewrite this into a standard form. He drew clean lines through the equation, simplifying without losing any complexity. The rhythm of chalk against slate filled the silence. The students leaned forward, drawn in despite themselves. Then, as if narrating for his own focus, he continued, if we use direct integration, the term here cancels with this coefficient. But that's only one way. He paused, turned to the class and said, there are three. A few students exchanged looks. Even Ashford's expression shifted. Slight surprise quickly masked. Elijah turned back to the board. Method 1, he said. Standard integration by substitution. It's the most conventional, but it collapses under boundary inconsistency. He demonstrated swiftly, erasing sections and rewriting them cleaner, sharper. The flow of logic was precise, almost musical. He reached the contradiction point. Here, he said, the equation fails, as expected. He moved to the second section of the board. Method 2, he continued. Partial transformation using Laplace principles. He set to work again, translating the variables, layering operations that even the most advanced students struggled to follow. Sarah Kim, one of the best in the class, frowned as she tried to keep up. Laplace transforms at your age, she muttered. He didn't respond. The second method flowed faster. It ended more cleanly, elegant but not perfect. Close, he said, but limited by the given constraints. And then came the third. He stepped back, took a breath. The classroom lights buzzed softly overhead. "This one's different," he said. "I've been working on something personal. A method that looks for repetition across transformation levels. I call it the cascade." Ashford tilted his head. "The what?" "The cascade method," Elijah said simply. "Instead of solving the equation directly, it follows the natural rhythm of its coefficients, cascading through convergent series rather than forcing linear symmetry." He began to write. The pattern emerged in real time, layers of substitutions folding into each other, collapsing and simplifying in ways that felt impossible. The class was silent. Even Timothy's mocking grin had faded. Ashford moved closer to the board, studying every stroke. He recognized elements of modular theory, echoes of group symmetry, the kind of synthesis that took mathematicians years to conceptualize. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, voice low. Elijah didn't stop writing. "I didn't. It showed up while I was working through something else." Ashford's stomach twisted. Showed up. As if it had simply appeared, unbidden. As if this child had discovered, not memorized, a method entirely his own. 5 minutes later, Elijah capped the process with a final line, boxed the solution neatly, and stepped aside. The board looked like a landscape. Part chaos, part clarity. The three solutions stood side by side, each correct in its own right. The final one glowed with an elegance the others lacked. "That," Elijah said softly, "is the simplest form." Silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint squeak of Ashford's shoes as he approached the board. He ran a hand over his mouth, eyes scanning the equations again and again. "You derived 3 methods," he murmured. "And one of them isn't even in academic circulation." Elijah nodded. "It's just logic, sir. Patterns repeat themselves. You just have to listen." The class broke into quiet murmurs. Some of the students, previously dismissive, looked at Elijah with something approaching awe. Others looked angry, as if betrayed by their own expectations. Timothy leaned toward his friend. "He's showing off." But even his voice lacked conviction. Ashford finally spoke again. "Remarkable," he said, tone cautious. "Though I'll need to verify your cascade method. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof." Elijah nodded. "Of course, sir." The bell rang, but no one moved. It felt wrong to leave, as if something sacred had happened in that room. Ashford finally dismissed them. Students filed out in stunned silence, their conversations low and fragmented. When the last of them had gone, Elijah gathered his notebook, his movements careful. He sensed the professor's eyes still on him. "Mr. Grant," Ashford said, his voice soft now. "Stay a moment." Elijah paused by the desk. Ashford sat, elbows on the table, fingers pressed together. "Do you understand what you just did?" "I solved your problem." Ashford smiled faintly. "You corrected my work. Twice. Do you know how rare that is?" "I wasn't trying to correct you, sir," Elijah said. "I just wanted to understand why it didn't balance." Ashford's gaze flickered to the notebook in the boy's hands. "May I?" Elijah hesitated, then offered it. Ashford flipped through the pages, scanning notes that shifted between dense calculations and quiet reflections. The work was meticulous, not copied, not rehearsed, but lived in. At the back he saw a half-finished proof, labeled Cascade Hypothesis. "This," he murmured, "is beyond anything I've seen from a student, from most researchers even." Elijah shifted awkwardly. "It's just patterns." Ashford looked up sharply. "Patterns are the foundation of the universe, Mr. Grant." He closed the notebook and handed it back. "You've done more than correct me. You've rewritten the way this class, perhaps even I, understand problem solving." Elijah took the notebook, unsure what to say. Ashford leaned back, studying him. "Tell me something. Do you ever feel unseen?" The question caught Elijah, off guard. "Sir?" "Unseen," Ashford repeated. "Despite everything you do right, despite every achievement." Elijah's throat tightened. "All the time." Ashford nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you'll understand why I test so harshly. Sometimes, to see who truly belongs, you have to watch who survives." Elijah frowned. "That's not teaching." Ashford froze. He wasn't expecting that. "No? That's protecting power," Elijah said quietly. "Not knowledge." The words hung heavy between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ashford stood. "You may go." Elijah turned toward the door, but as he reached it, Ashford's voice stopped him again. "Mr. Grant," he said. Bring your cascade notes tomorrow. I want to see every line. Elijah nodded once and left. The hallways outside buzzed with rumors. By lunch, everyone knew what had happened. The scholarship kid had not only corrected the professor again, he'd invented something new. But admiration wasn't the only thing spreading. Jealousy and disbelief twisted through whispers. He probably plagiarized. He must have had help. No way that's real math. Elijah ate alone under the oak tree. Same as always, though now even that space felt crowded by curiosity. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Stay in your place, Grant. Nobody likes a show-off. He deleted it without replying. The rest of the day blurred by, but the unease lingered. When he got home, his mother noticed immediately. You look like you're carrying the whole world, Eli, she said. He forced a smile. Just equations. She reached out and touched his cheek. Equations don't make you frown like that. He wanted to tell her everything. About the traps, the whispers, the professor's shifting tone. But he didn't. She worked too hard, carried too much. His burden would stay his alone. That night, after she left for her shift, he opened his notebook again. He couldn't shake the image of Ashford's face, the look of shock, then fear, not of Elijah, but of what Elijah represented. For the first time, Elijah wondered if his discovery threatened more than pride. Meanwhile, in his office, Professor Ashford sat alone long after the halls had emptied. Rain whispered against the windows. The light from his desk lamp turned the air golden. He opened his drawer and pulled out a stack of papers, one of his own published works, a paper that had earned him tenure 2 decades ago. The title glared up at him. On the boundaries of recursive symmetry in advanced differential systems. He flipped to the central proof, the one he'd built his reputation on. His eyes tracked the familiar lines, the elegant transitions. Then he froze. A single notation, one he'd always assumed correct, mirrored the same flawed sign Elijah had corrected yesterday. His heart pounded. He checked again, and again. The realization spread cold through him. The error had been there for years, in peer-reviewed journals, in his textbook, in the very theorem that bore his name. And the boy had fixed it, effortlessly. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel superior. He felt small, exposed. The thunder outside rolled like distant applause, or warning. Ashford reached for a pen, trembling slightly, and scrawled a note in the margin of his own paper. Recheck entire theorem, possible correction. Grant's method. But before he could finish, his office door creaked open, and someone whispered from the shadows. You're not the only one, he corrected. The hallway lights flickered as Elijah's classmates dispersed, whispers trailing behind him like ghosts. He moved through the corridors with quiet purpose, clutching his notebooks to his chest, the weight of what he'd revealed pressing at his ribs. Every pair of eyes he passed lingered too long. Curiosity, suspicion, awe. He felt watched, and he welcomed it. He made his way to the courtyard behind the classroom wing, where an old oak tree spread its arms over cracked concrete. He sat beneath it, opened his notebook, and stared at the final lines of the cascade proof. The air smelled faintly of rain, and a few damp leaves drifted across his pages. He traced the final variable, the point where the simplification collapsed into beauty. He had solved more than a problem. He had exposed his own hidden mind. He didn't notice when the footsteps came until they were close. Mr. Grant. It was Ashford's voice, lower than Elijah expected, carrying something like reverence and dread. Elijah looked up. The professor stood just outside the halo of light beneath the oak, umbrella in hand though the rain had eased. Ashford's suit was slightly damp, but he looked composed, or trying to. You showed something remarkable today, Ashford said. He held out a paper bag, as if offering sustenance. Inside coffee and a wrapped sandwich. You must be hungry. Elijah closed the notebook, wary. He watched Ashford's eyes, the way they shifted between admiration and calculation. He accepted the sandwich silently. Ashford sat nearby. He looked at the notebook in Elijah's lap. May I see it? He asked quietly. Your work. Elijah hesitated, but Ashford's tone had changed. Respectful. Tentative. He slid the notebook across to the professor. Ashford opened the first pages, scratched covers, tape reinforcing the spine. He flipped carefully, as though each page were a fragile map. Gradually he saw what Elijah had created. Proofs in number theory, partial explorations of modular forms, even early steps in topology. Some pages looked like drafts, Others like finished theorems, sketches of symmetry, experimental substitutions, conjectural leads. He paused on one page. A proof about elliptic curves, incomplete but breathtaking in ambition. A margin note in small, careful handwriting. Check step 4 with alternative transform. Ashford looked up. This is the work of someone at graduate level, or higher. You've been operating in silence all this time. Elijah's throat tightened. He had never allowed anyone to see these notebooks. Not teachers, not peers. They were his proof of belonging, but also his fragile shield. Ashford closed the notebook gently. Thank you for trusting me with this. He met Elijah's eyes. I had no idea how deep this went. Elijah exhaled softly. The moment felt fragile, poised between acceptance and danger. Ashford remained silent for a long moment, brows drawn. Then he stood. I have something to tell you. He gestured for Elijah to accompany him back inside. The rain had begun again, a gentle patter against pavement. Inside the building, the halls were nearly empty. Ashford led him to his office. A space of leather chairs, award plaques, and tall windows misted from rain. He closed the door softly behind them. Look around, he said, gesturing at the walls lined with mathematics journals, framed equations, departmental awards. This office houses decades of my work. I've published papers I believed were irrefutable. But today I saw something I never expected. Elijah sat opposite him. He felt a tremor, excitement, fear, both. Ashford opened a drawer and pulled out a sheaf of printed pages. These are essays, reviews, earlier drafts, my own work over the last 20 years, some with errors I never noticed. Since your correction in class yesterday, I've been rereading my corpus. He pushed the pages toward Elijah. On one he circled a sign error, on another, a coefficient misalignment. I found the same kind of sign inconsistency you pointed out. His voice was low. In one of my earliest published theorems, he placed his head in his hands. A mistake. Small, yes, but present in multiple instances. I assumed they were anomalies, but your method corrected more than this one classroom equation. You corrected me. Elijah sat silent, heart pounding. He had known the significance of that flash of insight, but not this, that he had overturned the foundation of a professor's legacy. Ashford's voice broke. Do you realize what this means? You didn't just correct me. You've called into question much of what I and others have accepted. He bent over the pages, tracing his finger over the equations. My reputation, my teachings, my authority. Elijah felt cold. This wasn't victory. It was exposure. It was risk. Ashford stood abruptly, pacing. He pulled down a framed photo of his early career, a younger man in front of a blackboard, and stared at it. Then he turned and confronted Elijah. I will support you. I will advocate for you. But we must be careful. The academic world is ruthless. Many won't accept corrections from a child. Worse, many won't accept them from a black child. Elijah's throat tightened. He had expected that resistance existed. He hadn't expected it to be spoken so plainly. Ashford continued, voice urgent. I want you to consider being part of a joint paper. We'll walk through your cascade method together. Verify it, substantiate it, publish it. Let the world see what you see. He paused. But if you decline, I will leave this in your hands. The notebooks, the proofs. You decide who sees them. Elijah stared. The weight of choice settled between them. He remembered phone taunts, whispers in corridors. He remembered nights working by candle, feeling unseen. Here was recognition, but recognition could be weaponized. He swallowed. I'll do it. Ashford nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. He extended a hand. Elijah took it. For a moment it felt like the world might tilt in a new direction. As Elijah turned to leave, Ashford cleared his throat. One more thing. He opened a drawer and produced an official-looking file. This arrived this morning. Your former elementary school, Dunbar Middle, submitted a copy of your school file. He handed it across the desk. Elijah's name was on the folder. Elijah took it, loaded and cold. He opened the first page. Standardized tests, teacher remarks, comments about behavior, potential, lack of resources. Then a memo at the bottom, signed by the principal. Grant demonstrated unusual mathematical insight, even in 4th grade. Multiple papers submitted to district math board. Elijah stared. He had corrected mistakes back then too. No one remembered. But someone had. Ashford's voice came again, softer. He attached copies of student notebooks you wrote in 3rd and 4th grade. Early proofs, scribbles, raw insight. He called them preternatural. Elijah's throat burned. Bits of memories flickered. A teacher handing back a paper saying, "This is too advanced." A peer laughing at his notes. Unspoken dismissal in every glance. "That means the recognition wasn't just here," Elijah said quietly. "Somebody saw me before I even knew I could be seen." Ashford nodded. "Yes, someone has followed your path longer than you realized." They sat in silence, the rain throbbing against the windows. Elijah pressed his thumb against the file's corner. Proof that he had always been more than they thought. At that moment, the office door cracked open. The janitor, startled, slipped inside. He carried a manila envelope, soaked at the edges, bearing Elijah's name. He handed it to Ashford, then left quietly. Ashford slid the envelope across the desk. Elijah opened it. Inside was a packet of printed pages, anonymous, no name, containing a formal critique of the cascade method, mathematical counterexamples, claimed inconsistencies. The critique was scathing, technical, confident, as though someone had intended to discredit Elijah before publication. Elijah's chest tightened. Someone had already made their move. Ashford's eyes darkened. "We have to prepare," he said. "Opponents will come. They'll attack your method, your notes, your character, but I will stand with you." Elijah closed the packet, heart pounding. The knowledge felt like a weight. Not just that he had been discovered early, but that someone wanted him silenced before he started. Ashford stood, moved toward the window, and looked at the courtyard. Rain pattered. The oak tree outside seemed smaller now, its branches brittle in the wind. "Elijah," Ashford said, "this changes everything. But perhaps most of all, it means they've been watching you for a long time." As Elijah left the office, clutching his notebooks and the anonymous critique, Ashford sat at his desk, flipping open Elijah's old school file, and discovered a hidden note in the principal's handwriting. "Protect the boy. Someone is trying to bury his brilliance." When Elijah arrived at school the next morning, the air already felt charged. The announcement board outside the main doors bore a new poster, bold black letters on white. "All school assembly. Today, 10:00 a.m. Under it, special address by Professor Ashford. No one had told students beforehand. Rumors raced through the hallways faster than feet. Timothy Ashford moved through the corridors with restless purpose. He had heard whispers of Elijah's solutions, of the notebooks, of the critique packet that had slipped into Ashford's hands. He felt that everything he'd been taught, everything he represented, was unraveling. The privileged son of a prestigious professor, groomed to carry on a legacy, he had taken his place for granted. But sitting near Elijah these days, he felt lesser, invisible. In the classroom, Elijah kept his distance from Timothy. He didn't look for alliances or confrontations. He kept his focus. Still, when Timothy entered, his eyes flickered to Elijah's, his expression unreadable. Elijah gave a curt nod. Timothy nodded back, then moved to a seat a little further away. At 9:58, the classroom emptied as students filed toward the auditorium. Elijah carried his notebook, the anonymous critique, and an uneasy sense that the moment had come. He climbed the risers in the school's grand hall, surrounded by oak panels and crests bearing decades of tradition. The stage was framed by the school's motto, "Knowledge unites, excellence distinguishes." For today, it would mean more. When Principal Monroe stepped to the podium, every head stilled. She was exacting and poised, rarely invited to speak for hours like this. She cleared her throat. "Students of Montgomery Preparatory," she began, voice firm, "we are gathered today for a moment that marks a turning point in our institution's history. How we define excellence, who we recognize, and what legacy truly means." She paused, scanning faces. In the front row sat Ashford, dignified yet taut. Timothy sat beside him, backbone straight, jaw rigid. Elijah sat further back, his heart humming with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "As many of you witnessed in room 304 these past days," Principal Monroe continued, "we have seen something rare. Not just correction of error, but innovation beyond expectation. That scholarship student, Elijah Grant, offered not only a solution, he introduced a new method, a method that caught my own senior faculty off guard." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some gasped. Others shifted. Timothy's hands clenched at his thighs. Principal Monroe nodded toward the stage's second podium. I asked Professor Ronald Ashford to join me. Ashford rose from his seat. He moved to the lectern, clearing his throat. His eyes met Elijah's for a fraction of a second, then turned outward. "Thank you, Principal Monroe," he said. His voice came steady. "What has occurred recently in my advanced mathematics class is something I neither anticipated nor fully predicted. Mr. Grant has not only challenged an error, but expanded understanding in ways I did not foresee." Murmurs scattered through the audience. Pride, disbelief, discontent. Ashford held up his hand and waited until silence returned. "As a result," he said, "I have recommended today that our next Montgomery preparatory representative to the National Mathematics League be, for the first time, a student from our scholarship program." A hush. Timothy's face drained. Students exchanged stunned looks. The myth that legacy equated privilege, inherited excellence, everything cracked in that moment. "But there's more," Ashford added. He paused, letting the weight of the reveal settle. "And to embody our commitment to true inclusion of intellect, regardless of background, I propose a new initiative, the Grant Ashford Mathematics Fellowship. It will fund and mentor talented students from underrepresented communities to engage with advanced research, regardless of financial status or pedigree." The auditorium erupted. Applause surged. Elijah felt pins and needles across his scalp. Some clapped enthusiastically. Others remained frozen, refusing to join. Timothy sat silent, hands folded. Principal Monroe spoke again, her voice firm. "We will launch this fellowship next fall, selecting an initial cohort of 10 students. I invite not only Elijah Grant, but any student who has demonstrated talent to apply. Excellence is not inherited, and it shall no longer be reserved." As students stood to applaud, Elijah remained seated, chest tight. He had not asked for recognition. He had only sought truth. Yet here it was, thrust upon him in public. Timothy rose slowly and walked up the aisle toward the stage. His footsteps echoed. Elijah watched, breath held. Timothy stood beside Ashford and the principal, his face polished, voice measured.
I'd like to say something," Timothy said. His voice quivered slightly, but he steadied himself. "I've grown up believing that legacy is everything, that the name you carry means more than what you create. But these past days have shown me that legacy can also be a burden. So I want to apologize publicly to Elijah."
A gasp broke through the crowd. Elijah's heart stuttered. Timothy's gaze held Elijah's, raw and awkward. Ashford placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. Principal Monroe nodded. The hall held its collective breath. Timothy swallowed, then continued. "I judged without knowing. I doubted because I believed in tradition. But now I see that tradition must also be honest. Elijah, your work is brilliant, and you belong here just as much as anyone." Some clapped, others stared. Elijah felt a rush of something: vindication, pain, humility. He didn't rise. He simply bowed his head, gripping the edges of his notebook. The assembly ended with fanfare. Students exited in clusters, voices high and low. Elijah remained seated until the room was empty, except for Timothy, Ashford, Principal Monroe, and security staff preparing to lock the doors. As he stood to leave, Timothy fell into step beside him, his voice low. "I didn't know how to apologize to you before today. I guess it's all I know to do." Elijah nodded, words heavy. "Thank you." They reached the door. Timothy lingered. Then he said quietly, "Don't think this changes everything for everyone." Elijah looked at him. "I didn't expect it would." They parted ways. Elijah walked down the corridor, notebooks clutched. The walls that once seemed imposing now felt like glass, transparent, fragile. When he reached room 304, the door was open. Ashford stood by the board, staring at the corrected equations Elijah had drawn earlier. He erased something, then paused, looking up at the doorway. Elijah approached the board. Ashford handed him a marker. "Write your method again," he said simply, "for everyone to see." Elijah took it. His hand firm, he rewrote the cascade method. Step by step, the room silent around him. The audience outside would soon flood in. Behind him, Timothy entered again. He stood silently, watching his rival turned ally. The tension still crackled, not malice but transformation. Then Principal Monroe and a few faculty members walked in. Cameras were present now. Journalists invited into the auditorium. The standing ovation began again, before Elijah even finished. But as he wrote the final line, he saw movement at the side door, a person slipping out, a silhouette disappearing into the hallway. Someone had come in to watch his public unveiling, and left quietly. Elijah froze, marker in midair. And when he turned to ask Professor Ashford who it was, the man beside him whispered, "I know who that silhouette was, and it changes everything." The auditorium lights blazed, projecting faces into clarity. The stage gleamed with polished wood, school banners draped behind the lectern. All eyes were fixed forward, as Principal Monroe raised her hand to quiet murmurs. Journalists and faculty sat in the front rows, smartphones and cameras poised. Parents leaned forward, notebooks ready. Students clustered in seats. The air felt electric. Elijah sat near the aisle, his notebooks resting on his lap. He felt the weight of every gaze, not the usual invisible scrutiny, but something more active now, like 100 expectations pressing down. His mind ticked through memories. The flawed equation, the cascade proof, the anonymous critique, the file from his old school. None of it had mattered, until now. Principal Monroe spoke, voice firm and deliberate. "This year, Montgomery Preparatory will make history." She paused, letting the tension build. After carefully evaluating every candidate, their mathematical insight, creativity, and resilience, we have selected a representative for the National Mathematics League. A hush swept across the audience. She took a breath. That representative will be Elijah Grant. The room froze. A single clap cracked the silence, then another. Applause followed. Hesitant, uncertain. Many hands remained still. Some faces beamed. Others looked stunned. A few students exchanged glances, laden with disbelief. Timothy, seated in the front beside Ashford, swallowed. His expression betrayed confusion, longing. He stood slowly, face stiff. The world he believed in was shifting. Ashford rose too, hands clasped at his sides. He gave Elijah a nod, a gesture both of pride and concession. Some faculty stood, clapping. A few clapped half-heartedly. Others sat rigidly, silent. The room became a mosaic of response. Principal Monroe continued. "This marks the first time in our institution's history that a student from the scholarship program leads our national mathematical delegation. We believe Elijah's innovations and brilliance represent the future not only of our school, but of mathematics itself." She gestured to Elijah. He rose, heart pounding. He walked to the stage between pillars and glare, clutching his notebook. The stage floor felt solid beneath his feet, but somehow unreal. He paused behind the podium, clearing his throat before speaking. He thanked the principal, the faculty, his mother's sacrifices. He spoke of patterns, logic, discovery, and how mathematics doesn't ask about background, only insight. Some faces softened, others stiffened, unaccustomed to humility in a speaker so young. He returned to his seat, amid applause. But as the claps echoed, the divide was clear. Some clapped warmly, others merely out of obligation. A few sat motionless, their silence loud. As the ceremony ended, faculty filed off the stage. Students rushed forward to congratulate him. Some patted his shoulder, others stared blankly, unsure whether to smile. Timothy drifted forward, hesitant. He reached for Elijah's arm, then paused. Elijah turned. Timothy whispered, "Congratulations." His voice was low, troubled. Elijah nodded. Later, outside the school, the rain returned. Students spilled into cars and buses. Elijah stood waiting for his ride. His mother approached, eyes sparkling with pride and worry. She wrapped him in an embrace, murmuring how she'd never been prouder. Meanwhile, Timothy walked behind them, silent. Ashford emerged, pausing to watch Elijah leave. His face was inscrutable. Whatever was shifting inside him remained hidden. As midnight approached, Elijah lay in bed, thoughts whirling. He stared at his notebook, pages open to the cascade proof, and the critique packet. Recognition had come, but under siege. At 10:30 p.m., his phone buzzed. It was Timothy. He hesitated, then answered. "Why did you do it?" Timothy asked, voice thick. "Why call me up tonight?" Elijah's heart skipped. "I wanted to apologize properly." The response was immediate. "Apology doesn't fix what my grandfather's done. He tried to break you today. Did you hear how he apologized to you in front of everyone? That was to save face, not to admit he was wrong." Elijah caught his breath. "Do you think he still regrets creating that trap?" he asked cautiously. Timothy didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his tone dropped. He regrets losing control. Elijah's chest tightened. Control. That was what this had always been about. Control over narrative, over talent, over who belonged. Timothy continued. Dad's calling me. I'm going to his office. I'll tell you what he admits, and what he hides. He hung up, leaving Elijah in the dark, with a rush of dread. Elijah didn't sleep. Hours later, before dawn, he got dressed and gathered his notebooks. He slipped out. The street lamp outside flickered in wet mist. He walked toward the school, toward Ashford's office. He reached the building, unlocked a side door, and crept along corridors. The hallways were empty, echoing with memories. He found the door to Ashford's private wing ajar. Light spilled from beneath. He entered quietly. The hallway was silent. At the end of the corridor, Ashford's office door stood partly open. Elijah moved closer. Inside he heard voices, Ashford and someone else. The words were muffled. Elijah's pulse raced. He crept forward until he could hear clearly. He's more dangerous alive than dead, said a smooth baritone. If his method spreads, it will unravel decades of prestige. Ashford's reply. I know. That's why I offered to co-author. We stand stronger together than alone. Those words froze Elijah's blood. He heard one last line, chilling, final. No one will believe the scholarship kid when we dismantle his integrity first. Elijah froze in the doorway, realizing the alliance he thought he was offered may have been a threat in disguise. The morning news channels ran footage from the Montgomery Preparatory Assembly. Students cheering, faculty applauding, Elijah Grant, stepping onto the stage to applause. His face was calm, poised, even proud. But behind that image lay nights when the lights flickered, and he worked by candlelight in a cramped apartment with peeling walls. That file from his old school had reminded him lately how far he'd come, and how fragile every step had been. As daylight broke beyond his bedroom window, Elijah sat at his desk, running his fingers along the spine of one of his notebooks, the one labeled Third Grade Conjectures. He opened it, peering at early scrawls, arithmetic manipulations, attempts at small primes, patterns drawn in shaky pencil. Back then, his mother, Lena, had taped his imperfect drawings to the refrigerator with a note, "My future." Those were dangerous words in danger's territory. He got dressed quietly and slipped into the kitchen. Breakfast was leftover oats. He poured milk slowly, eyes distant. His mother leaned against the counter, worried lines etched in her face. She watched him. You look tired. Elijah forced a small smile. It's nothing. She didn't press further. She knew him better than anyone. He left before the morning rush, walking to the bus stop under gray skies. The city downtown passed in blur. Broken storefronts, shuttered windows, a man sleeping under a bridge with a blanket. Elijah recognized that scene. It had been his life once, more than once. On the bus he reviewed the critique packet that had been slipped into Ashford's office, the counterexamples, the challenges to the cascade method, the claims of minor inconsistencies. They were elegant, plausible challenges, not crude attacks. Whoever authored them was subtle, prepared, knowing mathematics deeply. He suspected it was someone with access, someone who could move quietly in academic corridors and in shadows. Arriving at school, he made his way to room 3-4 for the first period, his heart pounding. As students settled in, his eyes drifted to the back row, a few desks empty. He wondered, would today be another test, judgment in disguise? He gripped his notebook and prepared himself. Later in class, Ashford walked in, tugging slightly the corner of his jacket, eyes sharp. He nodded at Elijah, then turned to the board and began writing. The lesson started routine, definitions, small proofs. Then Ashford shifted. He introduced a new problem, deeper and murky. He paused. I'd like someone to approach it step by step, including your thoughts. His gaze flicked to Elijah. Elijah rose, walked to the board. He wrote, paused, considered approaches. He spoke quietly, but confidently. We can try a substitution, but I'll also test a transformation, combining modular symmetry. He proceeded, cherry-picking pathways from cascade-style reasoning even before fully naming it. Some students watched him as though from a distance. Others scribbled notes, copying his steps. Timothy's gaze flickered with a mixture of resentment and wonder. At the end, Ashford nodded. Impressive. You keep stretching what this class expects. During lunch, Elijah sat under the oak again. He watched students walking by, some greeting him, some curious, some distant. He thought of past years, third grade, when the rent wasn't paid, and water got shut off. He remembered nights when his mother came home from 2 hospital shifts, hands trembling, making dinner with what little she had, smiling at him, telling him he was more than circumstances. He thought of the day they were evicted. The landlord's papers, boxes stacked along the curb, neighbors staring. They moved into a local shelter. He slept on a bottom bunk, counting stars through a barred window, desperately trying to keep the scribbles in his notebooks safe. The shelter lights went off at midnight. He memorized formulas in his head until his eyelids threatened to fail. During those months, any power outage meant darkness. He charged his devices where he could, at libraries, community centers, borrowed outlets. And still, he solved problems. In between shifts of sorting donated clothes, in between hours when other children watched television, he practiced prime distributions, found patterns in graphs, looked for symmetry where no one else believed there was one. Those months taught him more than math, discipline, humility, invisibility. That even brilliance can be unseen until it cannot be ignored. As the final bell rang, Elijah gathered his books and left. In the hallway, a school board member, Dr. Evelyn Pierce, stood near the exit, watching him. He froze. She offered a polite nod, but her eyes were sharp. He nodded back. He didn't know whether respect or scrutiny burned in her gaze. That afternoon, Elijah's mother came to his school. She insisted on waiting outside the building for the last bell, as she often did now that the press was covering him. They drove home in silence. As they turned onto the street by the apartment building, she asked softly, "How did today feel?" He looked out the window. "Strange. Good. But watchful." She nodded. "Be careful, Eli. Not everyone sees your light the way I do." He squeezed her hand. That night, Elijah lay awake. His mind spun. He opened his notebook, looked at the critique pages again. Who would want to remove him? Who had access? Someone in the school board? Someone in the math faculty? Someone who felt threatened by what he represented. At 11:47 p.m., his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Text. "Just because you're up doesn't mean you're safe." His chest tightened. He deleted the message without responding. In the dark, he thought of the change in the school boardroom, months ago, when Dr. Pierce had opposed one of Ashford's proposed reforms. She had spoken then of preserving standards, of worrying about lowering reputation if scholarship kids succeeded. He wondered, was this her? He flipped through his old school file again, the one provided to Ashford. The memo said he'd been labeled preternatural by his old principal. That paper had been submitted to the district math board. Someone had tracked him. Not newly, someone had been watching him long before he arrived at Montgomery Prep. He closed the notebook, breaths shallow. Then, just as he was about to drift to sleep, he heard soft tapping on the window. He sat up. Rain battered the glass. He blinked. Outside on the ledge lay an envelope. No return address. He approached and plucked it. Inside were photocopies of his old 3rd and 4th grade work, annotated with commentary, corrections, critiques, minor claims of plagiarism. Someone had been compiling his history, challenging his originality, before he even understood the question of ownership. His heart pounded. This was no accident. It was stratagem. He pressed his palm to the notebook, mind racing. And somewhere in the night, a single text arrived on Ashford's phone. "The boy's past is public. Destroy his foundation before his future begins." The morning after the envelope arrived, Elijah stood in front of his mirror and adjusted his tie. The reflection looked younger than he felt, a boy on the verge of turning the world upside down. He slid his hand into the pocket of his blazer and felt the weight of the critique packet, the photocopies, the notes. Today he would walk into Ashford's office and begin the work that could either elevate his name or erase it entirely. When he arrived at school, Ashford was waiting outside his door. His posture was squared, face stern but not cold. He nodded when Elijah approached. No greeting, no pleasantries, just presence. Elijah followed him inside. The office had changed since the last time Elijah visited. On Ashford's desk lay stacks of annotated articles, highlighted drafts, and a fresh printer spool of their joint manuscript. The title was bold: The Johnson-Ashford Method, Expanding Convergent Structures via Cascade Synthesis. Ashford watched him closely as Elijah's eyes swept over the document. "This is it," Ashford said. "We'll send this to Journal of Applied Mathematics. We'll be listed as co-authors." He paused. "But know this, Acceptance is not guaranteed. We face skepticism, prejudice, even hostility. Elijah nodded. He had been braced for that. But something in Ashford's tone unsettled him, the way he said even hostility, as though he already expected opposition. They began refining the draft, sentence by sentence, equation by equation. Elijah read aloud a paragraph. Ashford offered suggestions. They discussed word choice, notation, clarity. Every change mattered. They worked in silence at times, shared glances at others, challenged assumptions gently. The tension between them felt like co-creation, rather than contest. Midway through, Elijah paused over a section he drafted late at night, a boundary condition variant. Ashford leaned over, frown deepening. "This variant is powerful," Ashford said. "But if someone dissects this, they might claim your method is derivative of existing transforms, diminish your originality." Elijah's lips pressed. "We should include an appendix, a rigorous proof that shows no prior transform yields this structure. A historical survey to preempt claims." Ashford nodded slowly. "Good. Do it." They turned to the bibliography. Elijah pointed out a paper from 2012 he had found archived. Obscure, rarely cited. He argued how their cascade method diverged fundamentally from its transform approach. Ashford cross-referenced, frowned, accepted the distinction. The manuscript grew stronger, more defensible, sharper. By early afternoon, they had a near-final draft. Ashford printed the paper and placed it in a crisp envelope, addressed to the editorial board. Elijah watched as he sealed it. "There's one more thing," Ashford murmured. He opened a drawer and withdrew a letter bearing an MIT logo. Elijah's breath froze. Ashford handed it across the desk. "They saw a draft I pre-submitted when you corrected me. They requested to see the final version. They want you to present this method at their Young Mathematicians Symposium." Elijah's eyes widened. MIT. He had dreamed of that. But this was sudden. Ashford continued, "It's an opportunity, and a test. If you accept, your paper will be exposed to the highest critique. Supporters and opponents alike will weigh in." Elijah held the letter, hands trembling. "I want to do it." Ashford nodded, relief flickering in his face. "We'll prepare. Together." The rest of the day passed in strange anticipation. Students looked at Elijah differently, as though he bore not just talent but responsibility. Some offered congratulations, others shot uneasy glances. Timothy avoided him in the hall. It felt as though the entire school was waiting to see if the bubble would burst. That evening, Elijah sat at his desk. His notebooks lay open. The letter from MIT stared back. He had read it 5 times, memorizing every line. A part of him thrilled. Another part trembled at visibility. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Message. "Congratulations, but the greatest trials lie ahead." He closed the message without opening. He stared at the dark screen. Hours later, as midnight neared, he received another message from his mother. "I want to be there for your presentation. Don't say anything if I can't." He typed back, "I'll send you the schedule." He leaned back, exhaustion tugging. He thought of all the nights he worked in darkness, all the doors he passed while unheard, and now he was stepping into the spotlight. Then, just as he closed his eyes, his phone lit again. A video file. He tapped it. The screen flickered to life with static. Then clarity, 30 seconds of surveillance footage. Someone entering his apartment quietly, rifling through his notebooks, then leave. The timestamp was from last night. He felt the air drop from his lungs. Someone had broken into his private world. He shot up, heart racing. The notebooks were still where he left them. The envelope from MIT lay beside them. It was too well timed, too deliberate. Outside his window, rain lashed the pane. Footsteps sounded faintly below. Someone moving in the hallway. As Elijah raced to the door, his phone lit again with one final message. "Submit or we leak the proof's contradictions first." And somewhere outside, a shadow paused at his door. The weeks following the joint submission of the Johnson-Ashford paper felt like a pressure cooker. The school halls no longer echoed only teenage chatter. Now every whisper could be praise, skepticism, or betrayal cloaked in kindness. Elijah walked to class in the early morning light, clutching his notebooks like shields. The weight of expectations pressed on him, but he carried it with purpose. Immediately after classes, training began. Ashford converted his after-school office into a war room of mathematics. Whiteboards lined the walls, filled with draft versions of the cascade method, counterexamples, boundary constraints, endless proofs reworked, Retooled. Elijah sat at a long table with a few hand-picked students. Sarah Kim, 2 other advanced admits, and intermittently, Ashford's grandchildren. But Elijah quickly realized this training wasn't just for them. It was for the world watching. Each session began with warm-ups. Classic problems from past international math Olympiads. Elijah solved them comfortably, but Ashford never accepted comfort. He'd say, "We train not for easier problems, but for the ones no one expects." And then he'd hand Elijah something twisted, a new functional equation, a disguised combinatorial topology problem, or a seemingly impossible number theory puzzle. Sometimes he'd slide a critique packet under Elijah's nose. Always he pushed him beyond mastery into invention. One afternoon, Ashford spoke with gravity. "Elijah, your paper has drawn interest, but interest breeds scrutiny. We must fortify not only your method, but your defense. We'll practice under pressure, timed mock tests, blind reviews, and peer critiques. You must stand firm when they aim to knock you down." Elijah nodded. He felt older, sharper, heavier. The atmosphere of training became more than academic. It was psychological. Ashford encouraged debate. Students challenged parts of Elijah's proofs. Elijah defended, clarified, modified. Some arguments went late into the night. Sarah Kim, once intimidated, became a collaborator. Timothy sometimes paced the corridor outside, eavesdropping. And then one evening, Elijah found a note taped to the door of the war room. "Proof is your power, don't let them prove you wrong." No signature. It sent a new chill. Outside, rumors grew. Teachers speculated about the Johnson-Ashford paper. Board members whispered in offices. The anonymous critique packet circulated, quietly undermining confidence. Some students began to compare Elijah's progress to potential cracks. He heard from classmates who said, "Wait till he messes up," or "Watch for the breakdown." The tension cultivated itself. Still, training progressed. Elijah and Ashford created a special routine called cascade drills, taking a complex problem, stripping it down through 5 stages, then rebuilding it using varied methods. Sometimes, in the last stage, they would generate a result that matched none of the conventional solutions. They'd laugh in the discovery. Elijah sensed the method growing stronger, more flexible, more beautiful. One evening, deep into practice, Ashford handed Elijah a sealed envelope and told him to open it only at midnight. Elijah carried it home with him, heart racing, mind reeling. He reviewed worksheets until his eyes blurred, then opened the envelope after dinner. Inside was a problem, 6 bullet points describing a transformation of nested integrals, but with a twist, a piece of intentional ambiguity, a flaw embedded intentionally. Ashford's note read, "Solve it your way tonight. Use or reject the ambiguity. No collaboration." Elijah's pulse pounded. This test wasn't just about solving, it was about judgment. He set to work. The air in his bedroom felt heavy. His mother rested upstairs, but he worked in silence, candle lit, notes sprawled. The problem gnawed at him. Conventional paths conflicted. Boundary conditions shifted. Each approach seemed flawed in its own way. He tried algebraic substitutions, modular symmetries, transformations, and they all nearly broke. Then he paused. He flipped the paper upside down, rotated the structure in his mind. Suddenly, the logic reframed. The ambiguity resolved itself. He saw a reflection symmetry he had overlooked. The result followed. His heart pounded. He got a clean solution, one no conventional method would produce. He stared at it, breath caught. He had done more than solve it. He had transformed it. He brought that solution into the next day's session. He explained it to Ashford, step by step. Ashford watched, eyes narrowing, and his expression shifted. He nodded slowly. "You see beyond the obvious," he said quietly. The room went still. The other students looked at Elijah with something like astonishment. Training continued, but now with new purpose. That upside-down insight became part of their practice. Ashford would slip in hidden flips disguised as conventional problems, to see if Elijah would pick the mirror path. Some students failed. Elijah succeeded. Sarah scribbled notes, trying to follow. Others fell behind. Timothy watched from the hallway, jaws clenched. One weekend, Ashford arranged a secret mock competition. The participants included Elijah, Sarah, 2 advanced students, and a guest, a visiting PhD candidate from a nearby university, hired to submit problems beyond normal school bounds. The room was thick with silent ambition. The guest delivered 5 problems over 4 hours. Ruthless ones. Elijah felt adrenaline, but also the weight of consequences. He tackled problem 1 with confidence. Problem 2 stumbled him slightly. Problem 3 awakened his cascade insight. Problem 4 confused others. But he found a transformation, and problem 5, a monster of topology and number theory. He solved by methodically tracing the inversion trick he'd discovered under the envelope test. He finished with minutes to spare, including 3 alternative approaches. When the papers were collected, the guest smiled. Few in my graduate cohort would submit 5 full, clean solutions today. He approached Elijah. This work, it's original. You have potential far beyond your years. The praise was tentative, but powerful. Elijah felt both legitimate and vulnerable. Word of that mock competition circulated quietly. Reports reached Ashford's colleagues. Some nodded in approval. Others whispered that school kids shouldn't attempt grad-level proofs. Elijah sensed that once the competition began, they would scrutinize his work more than others. Meanwhile, the anonymous threats persisted. Elijah sometimes found pages missing from his notebook or notes rearranged. He watched over his belongings. He practiced double backups. He became paranoid in the way geniuses sometimes must. Every creak, every shadow felt suspect. And then came a moment of betrayal. One evening, Elijah arrived early to the war room. He found Sarah Kim already there, poring over his cascade derivations. She looked up startled. "I'm sorry," she said. "They told me to verify your method ahead of competition. I needed to see your steps." She held up a paper, a printout of part of the cascade sequence annotated. Elijah's heart pounded. "Who told you?" he demanded. She pressed her lips tight. "I can't say." He felt shock, hurt, suspicion. She had been his ally, and yet she now served someone else's agenda. The twist destabilized him. He existed in a world where talent, trust, and betrayal intersected invisibly. He stepped back from her, gathering his stuff. "Don't do that again," he said quietly. She nodded, eyes downcast. That night, as he lay awake, he realized the rival against him wasn't just academic. It was emotional. It would not only challenge his proofs, it would challenge his loyalties, his integrity, his quiet confidence. The morning of the Olympiad approached. Elijah's suitcase held 3 notebooks, his personal backup drives, printouts of the Johnson-Ashford paper in draft form, his critique packet, and a letter from He packed them methodically, slowly, each item precious, each packet a potential weapon or vulnerability. On the eve of departure, he stood at his bedroom window. Rain pounded the glass. He stared at the street, lights streaked by water. He thought of all he had sacrificed. Comfort, invisibility, ease. He thought of his mother, of her nights, of his journey, and he thought of the weight he now carried, not just for himself, but for every child told they couldn't belong. A final message popped onto his phone. Be the proof they fear, not the talent they dismiss. He swallowed. Tomorrow the world would see him, not just as a student or scholarship kid, but as a contender. The next morning, as Elijah walked into the competition hall, he spotted one of the anonymized critique authors in the corner, a figure from his old district, face obscured, watching him with a smile no one else recognized. The Washington, D.C. Convention Center's hall felt cavernous, a cathedral of intellect and tension. 300 of America's brightest students were seated at long rows of tables, their papers, pencils, and water bottles laid out like offerings. At the front, a flattened podium, large digital timers and backlit problem statements already flashed in their minds. A silence so heavy filled the space that even the hum of the air conditioning felt loud. Elijah entered last, escorted by Ashford and a few Montgomery Prep faculty. Cameras and reporters lined the sides. But inside the room, once the doors closed, there would be none of that. Here, performance would speak. He walked to his seat, row M, seat 13, a prime number. He slid into place, breathing shallow but steady. His notebooks lay beneath the exam sheets, tucked away for now. All around him were contestants with impeccable credentials. Students from elite prep schools, winners of national contests, children whose names already echoed in academic circles. But the hall belonged to possibility. A single glance might startle someone. A single insight could birth a legend. When the proctor called time, the digital timer began its slow descent. 5 problems over 4.5 hours. Elijah's hands moved, but his mind was still. He read all problems first, 3 relatively familiar topics. one ambitious hybrid, and one final enigma. His pulse steadied as he ranked them mentally. He noted 1, Problem 4, an area he'd expected to exploit with cascade insight. And Problem 5, the final question, caught his breath. It asked, prove or disprove that every even integer greater than a large bound can be expressed as a sum of 2 primes plus a perfect square. It mirrored Goldbach's conjecture, a legendary open problem. The resemblance jolted him, an echo of his life, the burden of bridging the unknown. He began Problem 1, the warm-up, with ease. Numbers, integrals, boundary constraints, all in his zone. The hall's hush remained, scribbles, erasures, occasional sighs. Elijah managed 3 test problems within the first hour, leaving most contestants still mid-equation. He moved on to Problem 2 and then Problem 3, writing clean proofs and offering optional simplifications. Some peers glanced his way, expressions drawn with awe. By hour 3 he faced Problem 4. The hybrid module demanded cross-field reasoning. He paused. He traced familiar patterns in his mind. He recognized a hidden symmetry. He applied his cascade insight, mapping multiple transformations. Other contestants fumbled. Elijah produced a neat, alternative proof. He placed a final boxed result. The proctor passed his row to collect the sheets of Problem 1 and 2. Elijah exhaled, heart steady. Then came Problem 5, the enigma. He stared at it. Goldbach plus a square. He'd studied additive number theory, but this twist was new. Most contestants would attempt small numeric checks, partial cases, hope for points. He did the same, mapping small even numbers, testing squares, primes. Then he paused. The problem felt personal, existential. It resonated with his own journey. 2 primes, 1 added weight, a perfect square as a structural term. He sensed a hidden metaphor. He flipped the sheet to page 2. There was a footnote, optional hint. Consider reflection and complementary representation space. That footnote, he realized, mirrored the upside-down trick he used under the envelope test. His breath caught. A hint provided in the exam? Unprecedented. He turned back. For 15 minutes he drew, erased, built, collapsed. Then he paused. He drew a reflection transform, invert representation of n, square, map primes, accordingly. Embed symmetry. He slid that in. The result matched. His logic held. The solution extended for infinitely many cases, though not a full proof, but a novel step bridging known territory with new insight. He boxed it, heart pounding. He wrote submission notes, moved to optional alternate methods, hedging against critique. He dared to step further, predictable methods, plus his cascade reflection approach. He completed the sheet with minutes to spare. He leaned back, breath shallow, scribbles filling margins. As the timer hit 0, he set his pencil down. The proctor called time and began collecting. Elijah watched others crumple or stare blankly. He packed his things, heart pounding, mind exhausted yet exhilarated. The hall felt charged. Outside, the press was waiting. Cameras, flashes, whispers. Elijah walked onto the stage as finalists were announced. One by one, names were called. Importantly, he made the list. The first name ever from Montgomery Prep to win gold-level placement. But whether first or top remained to be seen. That night, in the judges' chambers, the scoring committee convened. They dissected each solution, compared errors, debated originality. When Elijah's Problem 5 submission came up, faces shifted. One judge leaned forward, whispering to another, "He matched our hint with a transformation no one else saw. That's dangerous." Another said, "He's young but he's putting us in check." A third nodded, head back. Meanwhile, Elijah waited backstage, heart hammered. He replayed each step mentally, anticipating critique. His cascade, his reflection transform, would they be deemed bold or reckless? Then the announcer called the winners. Names rose. Gold, silver, bronze. Elijah's name echoed. Perfect score, first in competition's history. He walked to the podium under roaring applause. Cameras flashed. He accepted the medal, his voice steady as he offered thanks. But inside he felt tremors of something deeper than success. As he descended, Ashford met him, tears in his eyes. They embraced briefly. Tribute, relief, transformation. Students swarmed. Reporters yelled questions. Cameras swirled. Then Ashford leaned close, voice low. They accepted, but with a caveat. They reserved one judge's note. Confirm consistency on reflection map across all domains. Elijah nodded, mouth dry. Not all applause is unconditional. Later in his hotel room, Elijah stared at the medal on his nightstand. He replayed the judging room debate, the critique in his envelope, the infiltration of his notebooks, and a thought struck him. He had won, but the battlefield had just shifted. At midnight his phone lit, a message from MIT. Invitation to publish with us, and lead symposium keynote. Welcome to the big league. He smiled tightly. Then his phone chimed again, from an unknown number. Congratulations. Now the real tests begin. He closed his eyes, heart pounding. He realized, winning didn't end the challenge, it only opened new ones. In the judge's room, one door opened quietly. The silhouette of Dr. Evelyn Pierce stood inside, watching the medal ceremony through the glass. And she picked up a phone, voice low. He won. But do we really let him keep it? The moment the announcer pronounced perfect score, the auditorium erupted in cheers and applause. Cameras flashed. Faculty beamed. Elijah Grant stood frozen on stage, medal cold in his hand, heart pounding in his ears. He had done it. The first perfect score in the 44 years of the International Mathematics Olympiad. History had shifted. But as the applause swelled, a quiet undertow tugged at the celebration. Some faces remained still. Others whispered. A few students seemed unable to clap. Somewhere in the cheering crowd, a judge's heavy sigh passed unnoticed by most. Elijah smiled, shook hands, bowed. He thanked the committee, his mother, Professor Ashford, and even his peers. But inside, he felt the weight of every expectation, every doubt, every moment he'd been told he didn't belong. Each syllable slipped from lips molded by years of waiting. Backstage, reporters swarmed. Microphones thrust. Flashes stuttered. Voices collided. How did you do it? What was your strategy? Did you expect a perfect score? Elijah's responses were measured, confident. But when one reporter asked, "Do you feel pressure now that you've broken records?" he paused. The cameras caught his hesitation, the split second of uncertainty. Then he said, "I feel responsibility to myself, to every student who's been told brilliance isn't for them." Outside, the crowd gathered. Banners, placards, interviews, phones. The world would see him, but it would also question him. The medal ceremony continued. Gold, silver, bronze, names echoed. Elijah's chest felt hollow as the rivals stepped aside to let him shine. Yet the brightness exposed every shadow. Reporters pushed through. A camera crew from a national network dressed in black suits approached him. "Elijah, students at elite prep schools compete every year. Some people say this is an anomaly. How would you respond to those who doubt your performance?" he was asked. He straightened. "Mathematics doesn't lie," he said softly. "It doesn't care who you are, where you come from, what your zip code is. It only cares about consistency, logic, proof." The mic caught every word. The cameras relayed his face, composed, earnest, defiant. Yet behind him, in the judge's room, expressions shifted. The same judge who had whispered in deliberation now exchanged glances with colleagues. Doubts would be unearthed. The perfect score would not go unquestioned. Back in the hall, as participants mingled and congratulated one another, Elijah found Ashford. The professor's eyes were shining, but a thin line of tension crossed his brow. Ashford took Elijah by the shoulders. "You've done more than win a medal tonight," he whispered. "You've challenged what excellence means." Elijah nodded, the medal feeling heavier now than before. Students passed, offering hugs, handshakes, murmured praises. Sarah Kim watched from the periphery, eyes awed, pride stirring. Timothy drifted nearby, face inscrutable. Elijah noticed him, but didn't reach out. As he left the stage, Principal Monroe caught him. She offered a quiet handshake and whispered, "Montgomery Prep will never be the same." He nodded, the implication sweeping him. Later, at the banquet, champagne flutes clinked. Teachers, parents, dignitaries, all spoke of legacy, precedent, change. But Elijah felt something uneasy in the glances of board members. Pride masked by wariness, admiration tempered by judgment. When he finally returned to his hotel room, exhausted, the medal heavy on his chest, he stared at his reflections. The perfect score was a victory. But the world he entered would not treat it as simple triumph. He opened his messages. Congratulatory texts flooded in. "Friends, family, mentors. One stood out, a forwarded headline draft from a national news outlet. Public school kid dethrones elitism. Breakthrough or fluke. Comments scrolled below already. He probably had help. Media stunt. Let's see if he sustains it. Elijah's heart twisted. He deleted, then reopened, not yet ready to erase. He tried to shut his eyes, but sleep evaded him. He thought of that shadowy figure he'd seen in the judge's room earlier. Dr. Evelyn Pierce watching from behind glass. He thought of the anonymous critique, the envelope break-in, the whispers of sabotage. He had won, but the war had just begun. Outside his window, the city lights flickered. Reporters would broadcast tonight. Opinions would coalesce. Narratives would solidify. He would become a symbol, whether he liked it or not. As the hotel doors eased open, and staff passed in hallways, his phone buzzed one last time. Tomorrow's headline, he beat them, but will they let him be great? Elijah closed his eyes. The perfect score had changed history. But in the imperfect world that awaited him, the real tests were only beginning. In the distance through the darkened window, he saw a silhouette in the lobby camera feed. Dr. Pierce stepping toward an elevator, phone pressed to her ear, murmuring, "He's public now. Time to decide the narrative." After the Olympiad victory, Elijah's life felt both larger and more fragile. The world had convinced itself he was a phenomenon, a symbol rather than a person. But he needed grounding. So one quiet afternoon, he returned to the Northside Public Library, the place that had once been his refuge, his workshop, his invisible sanctuary. As he pushed through the front doors, the scent of old books and musty carpet enveloped him. The place felt the same, yet different. The faint hum of air conditioning, the janitor dusting shelves, fluorescent lights above. These constants anchored him. But now there were glances. A few students from his old neighborhood peered at him, unsure whether to greet or stay silent. Librarians whispered among themselves. The library had become a place of public interest, thanks to a boy who solved the world's expectations. He walked to his old corner, the one near the back window where afternoon sun slanted across tables. That spot where he once leaned over arithmetic scribbles, while the rest of the room emptied. He opened one of his old notebooks, and ran a finger across tight margins of early proofs. He felt the distance between then and now more keenly than ever. A small group of younger students sat nearby. Children from his neighborhood, scholarship kids from feeder schools. He recognized their eyes, guarded curiosity, the weight of doubt, dreams folded inside them like secret wings. One by one, they turned, watching him. Someone whispered, "Is that Elijah Grant?" The hush rippled gently. He nodded. They moved closer. He gathered his courage and approached them. "Hey," he said softly. "Want me to help you with that problem?" He gestured to one of their notebooks, strewn with algebra and half-written proofs. Their faces brightened. Over the next hour he guided them, not dictating, but asking questions, prompting insight. He saw the same spark in their eyes he remembered seeing in himself. The library, once a quiet haven, became a living classroom again. Word of his mentoring spread. Soon, middle school teachers and local community centers sent students. Elijah's sessions became weekly. Elijah's math hour. He taught basics and advanced problems, encouraged curiosity, and insisted that every question was valid. The library at night filled with whispers of modular arithmetic, Fibonacci patterns, geometry proofs. He sat at a borrowed table, surrounded by notebooks and highlighters. But he also felt change within himself. He was no longer just a student chasing validation. Now he carried responsibility. He felt eyes on him not only from students, but from academia, the media, and critics. Every error he made, real or perceived, would be magnified. He sensed that mentorship demanded strength he hadn't needed before. Self-doubt resurfaced, disguised as purpose. One evening, as he wrapped up a session, the head librarian, Mrs. Rowe, approached him quietly. Her eyes were wet. She pulled out an envelope and handed it to him without a word. He opened it to find a thank you note from parents, donation checks, and a small listing in a local paper headlined, "Local library hosts Olympiad champions free math program." The library would receive extra funding and attention. For once his brilliance was amplifying opportunity for others. Yet, amid that warmth, he received a chilling reminder, a text message. "You teach the youth, we decide the rules." He knew who it referenced. That night, he lay awake thinking of the silhouette he'd seen. Ellen Pierce's quiet interventions, the critique packet, the envelopes, the shadows. He understood that becoming a legend did not mean being safe. The next morning, Elijah entered the library to find a slim letter waiting on the front desk, addressed to him with the official seal of the Montgomery Prep School Board. He stared at it, heart clenched. He asked Mrs. Rowe to leave it with him. She nodded, eyes steady but troubled. He found a quiet corner, slid open the envelope. The letter was formal, measured. It acknowledged his achievements, praised his initiative with the library, applauded the Grant Ashford Fellowship. But then the twist. The board proposed to appoint him honorary mathematics ambassador to the district, a title granting him oversight privileges to mentor scholarship candidates in all feeder schools and influence admissions criteria. The language was gilded, but the power in it was unmistakable. His breath caught. Authority over admission criteria, that meant influence. But it also meant scrutiny, responsibility, exposure. The board, which had once whispered doubts about his belonging, now offered him a seat at the table. It was an olive branch and a gauntlet. He reread the letter. Beneath the formal tone lay an undercurrent. This appointment must be accepted by next Friday, or it will be offered to another. Time pressure. The offer was ambivalent. Reward, or capture. Elijah closed the letter, heart racing. He felt the tension in every sentence. He sensed that this was not a gesture of goodwill, only, it was a strategic stake, a way to embed him in the system he had challenged. It could empower him, or bind him. He looked around the library, the place that raised him, the place he now nurtured others. The quiet corners, the shelves, the tables of learning. The world expected him to transcend, to carry representation, but now it asked him to wear governance too. He tucked the letter into his notebook, fingers trembling. Outside, through the window, he saw a limousine slip quietly into the library's parking drop-off lane, an unfamiliar landmark. He felt eyes on him from beyond the windows. He wondered, had the board anticipated that move? As evening shadows lengthened, Elijah closed the session with his students. They gathered, thanked him, closed their books. He locked the doors behind them, then sat alone among desks and notebooks, contemplating the implication of the letter. The quiet that used to comfort him now felt loaded. And deep in the hallway, behind a shelf, he spotted just for a moment Dr. Pierce's silhouette watching him through a small glass pane. She turned and disappeared before he could approach. Elijah opened his notebook and found a new note penciled faintly on his last margin, in handwriting he didn't recognize. "We elevated you so you don't threaten us. Accept the offer carefully." The library's silence swallowed the words. The auditorium at Montgomery Preparatory was packed for the inauguration. Banners hung from balconies, reading, "Elijah Grant Mathematics Initiative." Parents, students, donors, faculty, many faces new, many familiar, all gathered under chandeliers that glinted like watchful eyes. Elijah stood near the front, his notes in hand, his heart weighted with memory and possibility. Principal Monroe took the podium first, voice steady. "Today marks a turning point not just for this school, but for how we understand potential and equity. Thanks to unprecedented support, the Elijah Grant Initiative will fund 100 students annually across public middle schools, charter institutions, and community centers to receive resources, mentorship, and access to advanced coursework." Applause rippled through the audience. Elijah watched faces shift. Pride, wonder, guarded hope. Ashford, now formally retiring, was next. He appeared older, softer, but his presence still filled the room. Stepping to the lectern, he spoke with a conviction refined by regret and redemption. "For 40 years I taught as though excellence required pedigree. Today I retire knowing brilliance demands inclusion." He paused, scanning students. "I have revised my curriculum for next year. Every advanced course will be open by merit, not by gatekeeping." More applause. Somewhere in the back, a school board member's expression was unreadable. Ashford's final act was to democratize his own legacy. Then Elijah stepped forward. His reflection in the glass panels along the walls multiplied. A boy turned symbol. He spoke without notes at first, letting silence lean. "Numbers taught me that truth is not about where you start, but how deeply you ask." He described the initiative's plan: scholarships, summer research labs, traveling lecture series, open access digital materials, archived proof libraries for students who lacked resources. He spoke with calm urgency, We are not saving talent, we are igniting it. Some audience members rose. Some still sat. The applause rose unevenly. But it rose. Cameras flashed. The energy felt historical. After the formal launch, Elijah walked the corridors of his school, guided tours pointing to plaques bearing his name, classrooms labeled Grant Scholars. In meetings that afternoon, administrative decisions were reversed, barriers removed, prerequisites reevaluated, teachers asked to mentor without bias. The school's identity was shifting. That night, Elijah sat at his own desk, stacks of textbooks and notebooks around him. He opened the draft for his homage, a new chapter in a soon-to-be-published textbook on differential equations that incorporated the cascade method, his reflection insights and the bridge transform he'd invented. He wrote the title Grant Transformations, From Hypothesis to Curriculum. The notion danced in his chest. He remembered the early days, the candlelit nights, the unnoticed corrections in textbooks, the moments he had to hide brilliance to survive prejudice. Now he was rewriting textbooks so that students would see themselves inside the mathematics, not outside it. Just as he leaned back, his phone chimed. A notification, an email from the National Publishing Board, sending preliminary acceptance of Elijah's textbook proposal, requesting inclusion in next academic catalogs. He exhaled, relieved, and exhilarated. Then a knock on the door startled him. He moved to open it. On the threshold stood a small child, maybe 9 or 10, clutching a library book with edges frayed. The child's eyes were large, hopeful. Elijah recognized that look, the same wonder he once hid. The kid's school uniform was modest, the shoes scuffed. He extended the book. Mr. Grant, I found this in the library. They said you helped people with this kind of math. The book was one Elijah had once used in secret. Foundations of Advanced Differential Theory. Elijah's throat tightened. He motioned the kid in. The child sat across from him, eyes shining. I don't really understand most of it yet, the child said. But I want to. In that moment, Elijah's own journey, from invisible student to institutional changemaker, came full circle. His textbook revisions, his initiative, Ashford's curriculum shift, all mattered because someone like this kid believed in beginning that day. He smiled. Then we start from here. He pulled a blank notebook and pencil forward. The child's eyes widened. The quiet room felt enormous. Across the city, in a modest public school, far from Montgomery's ornate gates, a shy student named Maya entered the library. She opened its door, browsing shelves. Her fingers passed over titles, stopping on a clean copy of Foundations of Advanced Differential Theory. She carried it to a desk, flipped it open, and found a note scrawled on the first page. To the next seeker, this is your beginning. E. Grant. She gasped, the echo of possibility igniting inside. Back in Elijah's room, the child drew a hesitant curve and asked, "What does this do?" Elijah leaned over, and in that moment, he realized. The initiative, the textbook, the shifts, they were never about him. They were about opening doors the world kept shut. He looked at the child, heart heavy and full. A legacy not of ego, but of invitation. And somewhere in that same moment, Dr. Evelyn Pierce watched the launch on a televised stream, narrowed her eyes at the sight of the child in the library, and whispered into her phone, "He's building more than mathematics. He's building a movement." How many times do we have to watch someone be punished for the color of their skin before something changes? If you had been there, would you have spoken up, or stayed silent like the rest? Type yes if you believe silence is part of the problem. Subscribe if you think this should never happen again.